Imagine being a teenager on the brink of one of the most anticipated nights of your youth prom, the event that promises glamour, laughter, photos, and for some, even the hope of being noticed, cherished, maybe even loved. Now imagine standing in front of your entire class, gathering the courage to ask someone to be your date, and getting cruelly rejected in public. That's exactly where this story begins. But it's not about humiliation. It's about healing, about how a single dad with grease-stained hands and a soft-spoken daughter turned a night of sorrow into a lifetime memory for someone who desperately needed it. And for all of us watching, this is more than a tale of an unexpected prom companion. It is a journey into what kindness, courage, and unexpected connections can mean. In a world where judgment often comes before compassion, the story takes place in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and reputations linger long after the moment that created them. James, a quiet, hard-working single father, ran a modest auto repair shop. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, but what he lacked in wealth, he made up for in integrity. His daughter Lila was 8 with eyes full of imagination and a heart that noticed everything. Even the sadness that others tried to hide across town lived. Amelia, a 17-year-old girl who had always kept to herself. She wasn't part of the popular crowd. She didn't post perfect pictures on social media, and she never made waves, but she had a gentle smile, a love for poetry, and a closeness with her grandmother, Mrs. Carter, who had raised her after her mother passed away. Amelia had been building the courage for weeks to ask a boy in her literature class to prom, and one afternoon she finally did in front of the entire cafeteria. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, but she asked, and the boy laughed, not kindly, not softly, but loudly enough for others to turn and stare before responding with something cruel like, "No thanks, I have standards." The cafeteria fell into that awful hush that follows public embarrassment. Amelia stood frozen, then turned and walked away. And that moment, though it lasted only seconds, imprinted itself like a scar. She came home early that day, her eyes dull, her mouth silent, and Mrs. Carter, who had seen many kinds of pain in her life, knew this wound wasn't just about rejection. It was about invisibility, about being told by the world, "You aren't enough," and that's where the heart of this story lies. What do we do when someone we love is hurting and the world has turned its back? Mrs. Carter made tea for Amelia, ran her fingers through the girl's hair, and as they sat in silence, an idea sparked, not out of pity, but out of fierce protective love and memory. She remembered James the mechanic who had once fixed her car for free when she didn't have the money because he saw she was struggling. She remembered the way he spoke to Lila so gently, as if even her smallest questions deserved full answers. And she thought, what if someone like that could remind Amelia what it feels like to be seen, to be respected, to be chosen? So the next morning, Mrs. Carter walked down to James's garage. She told him what had happened, about Amelia's heartbreak, about her wish to give her granddaughter one night of joy. She asked him if he would go to prom, not as a date in the romantic sense, but as a partner in kindness, a symbol of dignity and hope. And James, who had never set foot near a high school dance, looked stunned. But then he thought of Lila and how he would want someone to stand beside her if she ever felt that kind of pain. And so he said yes, and this is where the story begins to unfold into something more than just an unusual prom pairing, because real impact is born in moments when we choose to show up, not with perfection, but with presence. And this wasn't about James being a hero. It was about showing that masculinity can look like gentleness, that strength can be quiet, and that being a father isn't limited to the child you raise, but extends to the world you shape around them. And in this decision, we start to see a bigger theme emerge: how men can play powerful roles in healing emotional wounds without needing to dominate or fix everything, by simply being consistent, compassionate, and real. They can change lives, and in the middle of all this, Lila, the daughter, observed everything with the kind of clarity only children seem to possess when she heard what her father had agreed to do. She didn't tease or question. She simply said, "Daddy, I think she's going to feel like a princess." And that one sentence gave James more motivation than any pep talk ever could. The days leading up to the prom were filled with preparation. Not the kind you might expect. There was no stylist, no rented tux, no professional photo shoot, just intention. James borrowed a suit from a friend, shined his old shoes, and practiced polite small talk in front of the mirror, while Lila sat nearby, offering tips and Amelia. Well, at first she resisted, overwhelmed, embarrassed, unsure if she even wanted to be seen again. But as the day approached and she saw the kindness in James's eyes and the pride in her grandmother's voice, something in her shifted. She decided she would go not for anyone else, but for herself. And this is a moment we must pause to honor, because choosing to show up after being broken is an act of radical bravery, especially for young women in a world that often rewards only the loudest and most polished. Prom night arrived with the kind of anticipation that wraps itself in both hope and hesitation for many. It was about sparkling gowns, rented limos, and endless selfies. But for Amelia, it was about something much deeper. It was about reclaiming a sense of worth, a moment of dignity, a chance to feel like she belonged. And James understood that as he stood at her door, with a warm smile and a small bouquet of wildflowers, picked by Lila, Amelia stepped out in a simple yet elegant dress. Nothing extravagant, but it fit her like confidence. And when James saw her, he didn't say, "You look nice." He said, "Thank you for letting me be part of your story." And that line, more than any compliment, stuck with her. The car ride to the school was filled with soft conversation, a few shared jokes, and even a moment where Amelia laughed a genuine laugh, the kind that only surfaces when you begin to feel safe again. And as they pulled into the parking lot, heads turned. Students paused, whispers floated through the air, but it wasn't mockery. It was curiosity, then quiet admiration, because there was something undeniably powerful about this scene. A man not trying to impress a girl, but trying to support a human being who had been let down by her peers, and slowly the energy shifted when they walked through the doors. Some students snickered, but most simply watched as Amelia walked with her back, straight, her head high, and James by her side, not guiding her, but walking with her, equal, grounded, and present. And that night Amelia danced, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she wanted to. She smiled at people who had ignored her days before. And surprisingly, some smiled back, real genuine acknowledgement. Because sometimes all it takes to shift perception is one bold, unexpected act. And James never tried to dominate the evening. He stood to the side when Amelia chatted with others, clapped when she danced, and quietly offered his jacket. When the air grew cold, in doing so, he modeled something rare for teenage boys and girls alike, that masculinity can look like presence, not pressure, and that respect is the most attractive accessory anyone can wear. As the night unfolded, people began to approach them, not with judgment, but curiosity. How do you know each other? What made you come together? And every time James smiled and said, "Just showing up for someone who needed it." This story reminds us of how real-world examples show the same truth. Consider a story from Missouri in 2022, where a high school football coach volunteered to be the prom date of a student with special needs after her original date canceled. Last minute, his presence turned a painful memory into a joyful milestone, and local media later reported how the act of kindness rippled through the school, changing how students treated one another in the following weeks. These stories are not random. They are reminders that one person's willingness to step into someone's loneliness can rewrite a whole narrative back at the dance. As the final slow song played, Amelia stood still for a moment, watching everyone around her, and then turned to James. "Would you dance with me?" She asked, her voice still quiet but firm, and James nodded. Not as a man asked to perform, but as someone honored to be trusted again. And they danced simple, slow, no fancy spins, just a step-by-step rhythm that spoke of healing and presence. And people watched in silence, not with ridicule, but with reflection, because in that moment the entire room felt something shift, not just for Amelia, but for themselves. The night ended with a round of applause, not for popularity, but for courage. As Amelia walked out, she was no longer the girl who got rejected. She was the girl who showed up, who allowed kindness to enter, and who found strength in the most unexpected of places. And James, well, he returned to his modest home, tucked Lila into bed, and sat outside looking up at the stars, wondering if the impact of his small act had done more than he realized. And it had, because by the next morning, the story had gone viral. A photo taken by a student showed Amelia smiling in her dress next to James in his suit holding that bouquet of wildflowers, and the caption read, "This man gave more than a dance, he gave someone her dignity back," and the internet did what it does best. It spread the story not with mockery but with admiration. People began sharing their own memories of being left out and the strangers who made them feel seen, and soon news outlets picked it up. Headlines read, "Single Dad Makes Prom, Night Unforgettable with Kindness and Community." Pages filled with comments applauding the simplicity of his gesture. But the real change happened in conversations around dinner tables, in school hallways, in barbershops, in bookstores, where people asked each other, "What would I have done? Would I have stepped in? Would I have dared to be kind in public without needing recognition?" And this is where the script turns not just into a story, but into a call to action, because you don't need a suit and tie to change someone's night. You just need empathy, the courage to be present when it's uncomfortable, and the humility to know that sometimes the smallest gesture becomes someone's biggest moment. The morning after prom, James stood outside his garage sipping coffee, watching the early sun rise over his small town. When his phone buzzed with a message from a friend, it was a screenshot of a social media post showing him and Amelia on the dance floor, with a caption that read, "The real MVP of prom night," thousands of likes, hundreds of comments, and a flood of heart emojis. Later, James was still confused. He hadn't done it to go viral. He hadn't even known someone took a picture. But that's how real acts of kindness work. They ripple in unexpected directions, touching people far from the original moment. And as the day went on, calls came in from people he hadn't heard from in years. The local news station called asking for an interview. People stopped by the garage not just to fix their cars, but to shake his hand or drop off a thank you card. And that's when it hit him, how deeply people were craving authentic compassion. Not performative grand gestures, but real intentional choices to lift someone up without expecting a return. And Amelia, too, felt that shift. She walked into school the following Monday, not as the girl who got rejected, but as the girl who inspired a movement. She was invited to speak at a school assembly to talk about kindness, bullying, and the importance of standing tall after being knocked down. And for someone who once blended into the background, she now stood at the center of change. And this moment of empowerment grew not just in her school, but in other parts of the country where parents, teachers, and students use the story as a prompt for meaningful conversations about what it really means to show up for others. Some schools implemented Kindness Week, where instead of focusing solely on academics, students engaged in acts of community service, wrote letters of encouragement, and shared stories of resilience. One student in Illinois wrote to his school board suggesting they introduce a kindness partner program inspired by James's story, and the board actually approved it, creating an annual tradition where seniors support younger students through their first year of high school. All from a story about a man who said yes to being someone's date, not for love, but for love in its highest form. Empathy, James was invited to speak on a podcast hosted by a group of dads who shared personal stories about parenting, resilience, and emotional vulnerability. When asked what made him say yes to such an unusual request, he responded, "I didn't see it as a favor. I saw it as a reminder that none of us are ever too ordinary to make an extraordinary impact." And that line resonated deeply with audiences because we live in a time where heroism is often attached to fame or fortune. Yet the real heroes are those who show up with consistency, kindness, and integrity. And this is where we turn inward as viewers and ask ourselves a vital question. Where are we being invited to show up? Maybe it's a colleague going through a breakup who needs someone to have lunch with. Maybe it's a neighbor struggling with isolation. Maybe it's your own child silently asking for your attention without words. The truth is, opportunities to change lives surround us every day. They rarely come with headlines or hashtags. They come quietly wrapped in awkward timing or unexpected invitations. And like James, we have the chance to say yes to being that bridge between pain and peace. Meanwhile, Lila, who had been quietly observing her father throughout this experience, started asking different kinds of questions, not about cartoons or bedtime stories, but about how to help kids at her school who were lonely. She said, "Daddy, maybe we could make a club where we invite the shy kids to eat lunch with us." And just like that, James's quiet legacy began to take root in his own daughter. a generational shift not through lectures but through example. And this reminds us that our children don't become kind because we tell them to be. They become kind because they watch us be kind over and over again, through inconvenience, through discomfort, and through choice. As Amelia's confidence continued to bloom, she started a small project at her school called the Prom Pledge, encouraging students to think about who they invite to events not just based on popularity or beauty, but on friendship, effort, and authenticity. And the first year, more than 60 students took the pledge, leading to an increase in cross-grade friendships and fewer reports of public rejections. It became clear that this wasn't just a one-night moment. It was a seed that grew roots and began to transform how young people viewed inclusion and connection. And James, well, he continued working at the garage, fixing cars, changing oil, and making conversation with regulars. But something in his presence had shifted. Customers noticed he listened more deeply, cracked more jokes with nervous teenagers, and even hung a framed photo of prom night on his wall. Not for pride, but as a reminder that ordinary spaces can be home to extraordinary impact, and so can ordinary people. Months passed, and while the world's attention shifted, as it always does, James and Amelia continued their lives in that small town. Both changed forever, but not seeking credit for it. James's garage grew busier, not because he charged less, but because people trusted him more. They didn't just come for repairs. They came for conversations, for reassurance, for advice about life and family. And every now and then, someone would ask about the prom night, and James would just smile and say it was a good evening. Nothing grand, just a reminder that showing up matters. Meanwhile, Amelia found herself joining more clubs, participating in community events, and even mentoring younger students. She didn't become the most popular girl in school, but she became one of the most respected, and respected lasts longer than liked. The once soft-spoken teen now spoke with measured strength at school panels, youth conferences, and eventually at a statewide leadership event where she shared her story not as a tale of pity, but as a triumph of choice and kindness. She reminded listeners that it's not the rejection that defines you, it's what you do afterward, and her words resonated, especially with those who had once felt invisible. And in a particularly emotional moment during her final speech, she turned to the audience and said, "I was never looking for a prince. I just needed someone to remind me I wasn't broken." And that is the kind of emotional clarity that only comes from having been in the darkness and finding your own light. The story was eventually adapted into a short documentary by a film student who had been inspired by the viral post. He visited the town, interviewed James Amelia. Mrs. Carter and even Lila. The documentary gained traction at student film festivals, praised not for cinematic flair, but for emotional honesty. And through that project, a new theme emerged: how small towns often hold big stories, and how compassion can echo longer than conflict. James never changed who he was. He still drove his dusty pickup truck, still wore the same work boots, still lived in the same modest house. But the way people saw him changed, and more importantly, the way people saw the power of simple choices changed. He wasn't a celebrity, he was a citizen, someone who reminded everyone that character is measured by consistency and that heroism is often quiet, humble, and without an audience. One day, months later, James received a letter from a high school senior in another state who had read about him in a local paper. The letter said, "I was going to skip prom because I didn't feel like I mattered. Then I read about what you did, and it made me believe that maybe, just maybe, someone would see me, and that's why I'm going and bringing my best friend who also feels left out. Thank you for helping me be brave." And that single letter meant more to James than all the online praise combined, because it proved the point that one kind act can multiply across borders, across schools, and across hearts. It reminds us that our lives are not only ours to live, they're also examples for others to follow. And that's what legacy really is. Not the buildings with our names on them, but the lives we helped lift, the hearts we helped heal, and the stories that continue even when we are no longer in them. In the final scene of the documentary, the filmmaker asks James what he hopes people remember about him, and James pauses, shrugs, and says, "Maybe just that I showed up when it mattered." And there it is, the entire ethos of this journey summed up in one simple sentence. That is the lesson we must take with us as viewers and human beings: to choose to show up when it matters, not just for people we know, but for those we don't, to accept the inconvenient invitations to be present, even when it's uncomfortable, to model to our children that kindness is not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of strength. We live in a world where attention spans are short and scandals make headlines. But stories like this remind us that what endures is sincerity, what resonates is respect, and what transforms is intentional action. So whether you're a single dad, a student, a teacher, or just someone trying to make sense of your place in the world, ask yourself, where can I be, James? Not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent ones, because the truth is we all have someone watching, someone who needs our example, someone who will one day tell their story and say, I was seen, I was believed in, I was invited back into the light, and that is the kind of story worth living. The ripple effects of one night continued to stretch long after the final song ended. The flowers withered and the glitter was swept from the gym floor. Amelia graduated with more confidence than she had ever imagined, carrying not only her diploma, but a new sense of purpose. She applied to college, choosing to study social work inspired by her own experiences of being overlooked, then lifted, and she wrote her college entrance essay about that night, about the choice someone made to walk beside her when others stepped away. And that essay earned her a full scholarship because the admissions board said her story embodied resilience, humanity, and leadership. And James, well, he never bragged, never sought applause. He kept showing up to work, fixing broken things. Not just cars, but confidence, community, and character. He began mentoring other single fathers in town, not through lectures, but through coffee chats and shared struggles, reminding them that fatherhood is not about perfection. It's about presence, showing up even when you're tired, lost, or unsure. Lila grew up knowing her dad wasn't just a mechanic. He was someone who taught her how to see people, not just look at them, how to listen with her heart, not just her ears, and how to offer kindness even when it feels awkward or small. And if every generation taught those lessons the way James did, maybe the world would look a little softer, a little stronger, and a lot more connected as the years went by. New prom nights came and went, but every spring, someone at Amelia's old school told the story of the girl who went with a mechanic, the man who reminded everyone that one night of compassion can echo into a lifetime of impact. And this story isn't just for entertainment, it's an invitation to all of us. What will you do the next time someone stands alone? The next time someone is laughed at, overlooked, or forgotten? Will you walk by or will you pause? Offer your presence and say you matter. Because what this story proves more than anything is that being there matters, that when the lights dim and the crowd disperses, what remains is how we made people feel seen, heard, and loved. And so as we close this story, let's take the lesson with us. You don't need to be a millionaire or a genius or a celebrity to change a life. You just need to care enough to show up. And when you do, you might find that in giving someone else a moment of healing, you begin healing too, because compassion is never one way. It lifts both the giver and the receiver, and in that sacred exchange, lives are transformed. So let us be like James. Let us raise kids like Lila, and let us believe in young women like Amelia, because in a world that can often feel cruel, hurried, and disconnected, we can choose to be the gentle exception, the one who walks into someone's hardest moment and reminds them that they are not alone.